The air in the courtroom was tense as Judge Margaret Holloway sat high on her bench, peering down at the defendant before her. The man standing at the defense table was Darnell Hayes, a well-dressed black man in his 40s, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Hayes, you think you can walk into my courtroom and waste my time?" Judge Holloway sneered. "You people always think you're above the law." A hushed murmur rippled through the gallery. Darnell clenched his jaw but remained composed. He had dealt with people like her before. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I am simply here to ensure that justice is served." Judge Holloway scoffed. "Justice? Don't make me laugh. You should be grateful I'm even allowing you to speak." Gasps echoed through the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Even the bailiff seemed uneasy. But Judge Holloway was known for her prejudice, and she ruled her courtroom with an iron fist. Darnell simply smiled. "I understand, Your Honor, but I'd advise you to choose your words carefully." Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hayes?" "Not at all," Darnell said smoothly. "I believe actions speak louder than words." Judge Holloway scoffed again. "You'll be lucky if you walk out of here without contempt charges." The courtroom door creaked open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He carried himself with authority, his sharp gaze locking onto Judge Holloway. "Excuse me, Your Honor," the man interrupted. "I need a moment of your time." Judge Holloway looked irritated. "Who do you think you are, barging into my courtroom like this?" The man smirked. "I'm the last person you want to offend today, Judge Holloway." Darnell watched, his smile widening. The game had just begun. Judge Holloway glared at the man who had just entered. His confidence unsettled her, but she wasn't one to back down. "I don't recall granting permission for interruptions in my courtroom," she snapped. "State your name and business, or get out." The man smirked and pulled out a badge, holding it up for the entire courtroom to see. Gasps filled the room. "My name is Samuel Wright, U.S. Federal Marshal," he announced, "and I'm here regarding an urgent matter concerning you, Judge Holloway." The judge's face paled, but she quickly recovered, laughing dismissively. "Oh, this is rich. A federal marshal barging into my court? On what authority?" Marshal Wright took a step forward. "On the authority of the Department of Justice, and if you'd bothered to check, you'd know I outrank you." Darnell watched the exchange with a knowing smile, his arms crossed. "Mr. Hayes, you seem awfully amused," Judge Holloway sneered, her confidence returning. "Did you orchestrate this little charade?" Darnell shook his head. "I didn't have to. Your own actions brought this upon you." Marshal Wright nodded. "That's right, Judge Holloway, you've been under federal investigation for months now. Racial discrimination, judicial misconduct, and tampering with legal proceedings. We have undeniable evidence against you." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Some people looked shocked, while others, especially the black attorneys and defendants who had suffered under her rulings, looked relieved. You're lying," Holloway shouted, her voice trembling slightly. Wright didn't flinch. "I have a warrant for your arrest signed by the Attorney General herself, and the man you've been insulting?" He gestured toward Darnell. "He played a key role in exposing you." Judge Holloway's expression twisted into rage. "This is absurd. I am the law here." Marshal Wright shook his head. "Not anymore." Judge Holloway's face twisted with fury. She slammed her gavel down, the sharp crack echoing through the stunned courtroom. "This is my courtroom," she bellowed, "and I will not be disrespected like this. Officers, remove this man at once." The two courthouse security officers hesitated. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure of what to do. A federal marshal's authority outranked a state judge, and arresting him on her orders could cost them their jobs. Marshal Wright remained unfazed. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned, pulling out an official document from his briefcase. "This is a federal arrest warrant, signed, sealed, and legally binding." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. People whispered among themselves, their shock evident. The same judge who had ruthlessly humiliated and punished so many now stood accused. Darnell leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Seems like justice is finally catching up with you, Judge Holloway." Her eyes darted around the room. For the first time, she realized she wasn't in control. The bailiff, her usual enforcer, had stepped back, unwilling to get involved. The audience, mostly victims of her biased rulings, looked at her with something between satisfaction and disbelief. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at Darnell. "You planned this." Darnell chuckled. "I didn't have to. Your own actions did all the work." Marshall Wright took a step closer. "Judge Holloway, if you resist arrest, additional charges will be added. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Her mouth opened to argue, but she froze. The weight of the moment hit her. The courtroom, the very place where she once held absolute power, was now a cage closing in on her. "Put your hands where I can see them," Wright ordered. For the first time in her career, Judge Holloway had no choice but to comply. Judge Holloway's hands trembled as she slowly raised them. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the occasional gasp from the spectators. Marshall Wright nodded to the bailiff, who reluctantly stepped forward with handcuffs. "This is a mistake," Holloway shouted, her voice laced with desperation. "I'm a sitting judge. You can't do this." Darnell crossed his arms, watching the scene unfold with measured calm. "You're right about one thing," he said. "You were a judge, but today, you're just another defendant facing justice." The bailiff hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Marshall Wright. "I mean, she's—" "A criminal," Wright interrupted. "And in my jurisdiction, we don't let criminals sit on the bench." The audience murmured again. Some of Holloway's past victims sat on the benches, their eyes filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. One woman whispered to her husband, "I never thought I'd see the day." "Your Honor, I mean Judge Holloway," Wright corrected himself. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and several counts of civil rights violations." Holloway's face turned red. "You can't do this," she snapped. "I am the law." "No," Darnell said, stepping closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "The law is bigger than you, and it's finally catching up." The bailiff snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. The cold steel seemed to drain the last bit of arrogance from her face. "Take her into custody," Wright ordered. As Holloway was led toward the exit, the courtroom erupted into applause. For years, she had ruled with an iron fist, ruining lives without consequence. But today, the people she had oppressed were witnessing something they never expected. Justice turning on the one who had abused it the most. The sound of Judge Holloway's heels scraping against the floor as she was led away echoed in the courtroom. Gasps turned into murmurs, and murmurs into a full-blown uproar. Some people stood, clapping, while others stared in disbelief. "This can't be happening," Holloway shrieked, her voice cracking as she twisted against the bailiff's grip. "I built this courtroom. I made the rules." Darnell, standing tall, let her words wash over him. He had spent years enduring the corruption of judges like Holloway. Today wasn't just about him. It was about everyone she had wronged. "Quiet in the courtroom," Marshall Wright barked, though even he knew it was a futile command. People were celebrating, whispering to one another about how long overdue this was. Some victims had tears in their eyes, watching the woman who had once ruined their lives now facing consequences. Holloway's lawyer, a frantic-looking man in his 40s, stepped forward. "This is unlawful," he argued. "You can't arrest a sitting judge without proper authority." Wright smirked. "I think you'll find we have all the authority we need." He handed over a thick file to the court clerk. "This is an official warrant, signed by the Federal Ethics Committee. Judge Holloway has been under investigation for months." Holloway's face paled. "What?" she whispered. Darnell folded his arms. "Looks like you weren't as untouchable as you thought." The courtroom doors swung open and 2 federal agents entered. The air in the room grew tense as they approached. "Is she ready for transport?" one of them asked. Marshall Wright nodded. "Take her in." Holloway's scream of protest faded as she was dragged out of the courtroom, leaving behind the very people she had once oppressed, watching her downfall in satisfaction. As Judge Holloway was dragged away, the courtroom remained in stunned silence. Some whispered in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances. This moment had been a long time coming. Darnell took a deep breath and turned toward Marshall Wright. "How long has she been under investigation?" he asked. Wright folded his arms. "Months. Maybe even years if you count the complaints stacking up. But we needed solid proof before we could act, and thanks to her little display today, we got exactly what we needed." Darnell nodded, but a part of him still boiled with anger. How many innocent people had suffered under her rulings? How many lives had she destroyed just because of her prejudice? A woman in the audience stood up. "She ruined my son's life," she said, her voice shaking. "She gave him 10 years for a minor offense. I begged her to reconsider, but she just laughed." A man beside her clenched his fists. "Same here. She threw out my discrimination case without even reading the evidence." More voices joined in, recounting their own experiences. It became clear that Holloway's reign had left deep scars in the community. Darnell stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. "Justice doesn't end here," he said firmly. "Every wrongful case she handled needs to be reviewed. Every life she destroyed needs a second chance." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Wright nodded. "We're already working on it. But people like her don't work alone. There's more corruption hiding in plain sight, and we intend to root it out." Darnell glanced at the judge's empty chair, feeling the weight of the moment. Holloway was just one piece of a much bigger problem. But today, at least, justice had finally won. As the news of Judge Holloway's arrest spread, the courthouse buzzed with reporters, attorneys, and citizens who had been waiting for this moment. The once feared judge, now in handcuffs, had become the center of a scandal that shook the entire legal system. Darnell watched from a distance as she was escorted out of the building, her face red with humiliation. But he knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the countless lives she had ruined under the guise of justice. Marshall Wright approached him, a stack of files in his hands. "We've started going through her case history," he said. "The number of questionable rulings is staggering." Darnell frowned. "How many cases are we looking at?" Wright sighed. "Hundreds, maybe more. Most of them involve harsh sentences against Black and Latino defendants, often for minor crimes. And then there are cases where she let wealthier white defendants walk free despite overwhelming evidence against them." Darnell clenched his jaw. "So, she wasn't just racist, she was corrupt." Wright nodded. "And the worst part, she had help. Other judges, prosecutors, even some defense attorneys played along because it benefited them." The weight of the revelation settled heavily on Darnell. He had always suspected corruption in the system, but seeing it laid out so plainly made his stomach turn. "We have to fix this," Darnell said, determination burning in his voice. "Every one of her victims deserves a second chance, and everyone who helped her needs to be held accountable." Wright placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We will, but this is only the beginning." Darnell looked around the courthouse, realizing that today was more than just one victory. It was the start of a fight for true justice. As Judge Holloway sat in a holding cell, the weight of her downfall began to sink in. The arrogance she had once wielded so effortlessly had vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating fear. She knew her career was over, but what scared her more was the idea that she might face the same harsh sentences she had so mercilessly handed down to others. Meanwhile, Darnell and Marshall Wright were deep in discussion. The evidence against Holloway was damning, but they both knew she hadn't acted alone. The judge was merely one piece of a much larger puzzle. "We have names," Wright said, sliding a thick file across the desk. "Prosecutors, police officers, even some so-called defense attorneys. They all played a part in this racket." Darnell flipped through the pages, disgusted by what he saw. Wrongful convictions, missing evidence, fabricated testimonies. It was a pattern that had gone unchecked for years. "This isn't just about Judge Holloway," Darnell muttered. "This is an entire system designed to keep people like me from ever standing a chance." Wright nodded grimly. "And that's exactly why we have to take them all down." Across town, news channels were broadcasting the shocking developments. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice for those who had been wrongfully convicted. Families who had suffered at Holloway's hands finally felt a sliver of hope. But not everyone was celebrating. Inside an expensive law office, a group of lawyers and officials watched the news in silence. One of them, a senior judge, leaned forward and muttered, "If Carter thinks he's going to clean house, he's got another thing coming." The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Darnell knew exposing Judge Holloway was just the beginning. He had unearthed a web of corruption so deep that taking down one judge wouldn't be enough. There were still others, officials who had grown comfortable in their abuse of power, certain they were untouchable. As he prepared for the next steps, his phone rang. It was Marshall Wright. "You need to be careful," Wright warned. "We've rattled a hornet's nest. Holloway was important to them. They're going to come after you now." Darnell sighed. He had expected this, but hearing it aloud made it feel real. "Let them try. I've been fighting my whole life. I'm not backing down now." Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Holloway was finally realizing how alone she truly was. She had spent her career protecting corrupt prosecutors and officers, but now no one was coming to save her. She demanded a phone call and was granted one. Her fingers trembled as she dialed a number. When the voice on the other end answered, she spat, "You promised me protection." There was a long silence before the man replied coldly, "You were useful until you got caught. Now you're just another liability." Holloway's stomach dropped. She had seen this play out before, with defendants she had sentenced, but she had never thought she'd be on the receiving end. At that moment, the cell door opened. A federal agent stepped inside. "Judge Holloway, we need to talk. We have a deal to offer you, if you're willing to cooperate." Holloway's mind raced. She had spent years making people feel powerless. Now, for the first time, she understood what it was like. Judge Holloway sat across from the federal agent, her once commanding presence now reduced to a shadow of itself. The metal table between them felt colder than ever, a stark reminder of how quickly her world had collapsed. "You have two choices," the agent said, sliding a file toward her. "You cooperate and give us names, everyone involved in your corrupt network, or you go down alone. And trust me, your so-called friends won't lift a finger to help you." Holloway's jaw clenched. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, protected by the very system she had manipulated. Now the same people she once shielded were nowhere to be found. "What's in it for me?" she asked, trying to regain some sense of control. The agent smirked. "You might avoid the maximum sentence. Maybe." She scoffed. "That's not much of a deal. It's better than what you'll get otherwise." He leaned forward, voice firm. "We already have the evidence, the bribery, the wrongful convictions, the fabricated charges. You're done. This is your only way out." Holloway's hands trembled. She had sentenced countless people without a second thought, never caring about their lives. Now, she was the one facing judgment. She exhaled sharply. "Fine, but I want protection." The agent stood up. "Start talking first, then we'll see." As the door shut behind him, Holloway realized she had no real choice. For the first time, she was at the mercy of the system she had so ruthlessly controlled. Judge Holloway sat in the interrogation room, her palms sweaty as she flipped through the pages of the file before her. The federal agents had compiled an airtight case against her. Bank records, witness statements, even secretly recorded conversations. She was trapped. "You're going to have to give us something," the agent said, his tone firm. "Names, dates, evidence, everything you have." Holloway swallowed hard. She had built her career on power, arrogance, and corruption. But now that empire was crumbling, and the only way to lessen her own fall was to take others down with her. She exhaled sharply. "Fine, I'll talk." The agent nodded. "We're listening." She began listing names, judges, prosecutors, police officers, all individuals who had been part of the system that thrived on exploiting innocent people. Some took bribes, some framed defendants, and others ensured that those with power never faced consequences. "And what about Robert Gaines?" the agent asked. Holloway's throat went dry. Robert Gaines was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city, a businessman who had funded campaigns, pulled strings behind closed doors, and most importantly, kept her protected. "If I give him up, I'm dead," she whispered. The agent leaned in. "If you don't, you'll rot in prison." A deep silence filled the room. The weight of her past decisions was finally crushing her. She closed her eyes. "Fine. I'll give you everything on him, but I need a deal in writing." The agent smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere." As Holloway signed the agreement, she realized the inevitable. She had just sealed her own fate. News of Judge Holloway's arrest spread like wildfire. Every major news outlet covered the story. Corrupt judge exposed in federal sting. The once powerful woman, who had ruled her courtroom with arrogance and prejudice, was now a disgraced criminal. In the city's legal community, shockwaves rippled through law offices, police departments, and government buildings. Judges, prosecutors, and officers who had once worked closely with Holloway were now scrambling to cover their tracks, fearing they might be next. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in his lawyer's office, watching the breaking news unfold on the television. He had fought for years against the injustices of the system, and now the very judge who had tried to humiliate him was about to face real justice. "She's naming names," Malcolm's lawyer said, shaking his head. "This might be bigger than we thought." Malcolm nodded. "It's about time someone pulled back the curtain on this mess." Across town, Holloway sat in a holding cell, her hands trembling. She had spent years sending people to prison, but now the roles had reversed. The prison guards, many of whom she had sentenced harshly in the past, stared at her with cold indifference. One guard smirked. "Welcome to the other side, Judge." Holloway glared at him, but deep down she knew there was no escaping this. Back outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for any new developments. The scandal was far from over, and Malcolm knew this was just the beginning. Justice was finally being served. As the sun rose over the city, Malcolm stood in front of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters. His calm yet determined voice carried over the murmurs of the press. "This case wasn't just about me," he began. "It was about every person who has ever faced injustice in a system meant to protect them." Judge Holloway thought she was untouchable, but today proves that no one is above the law. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Holloway's arrest had ignited a broader investigation. The FBI had already begun looking into other cases she had presided over, reopening trials where bias had played a role. Several of her allies in the legal system were now under scrutiny, and some had already resigned before the hammer could fall on them too. Inside the courthouse, Holloway sat in front of a judge, this time not as the one holding power, but as a defendant. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, she looked like a shadow of the woman who had once belittled those who stood before her. The court finds the defendant, Margaret Holloway, guilty of judicial misconduct, abuse of power, and multiple counts of bribery, the judge announced. She will remain in custody until sentencing. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Holloway clenched her fists, her face red with humiliation. But no amount of anger could change the fact that her reign of injustice had come to an end. Outside, Malcolm walked down the courthouse steps, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had fought the system and won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Justice had finally prevailed. If you believe in standing up against injustice and holding those in power accountable, 10,000 subscribe, like, and share this story. Let's continue the fight for fairness and equality in our legal system. Your voice matters. Speak up, stay informed, and demand justice for all.